As if the old city of Matera wasn't spectacular enough already, a short hike outside the city walls reveals something even more ancient. By itself, the old city of Matera is already extremely beautiful to explore, but there are also hiking trails that take you around the city. What we've done is we've actually hiked for a little while. We've hiked down the valley and up the other side to a network of ancient caves. And doing some research, I actually saw some of these caves and thought it might be a great opportunity to frame the city in a different way. The shot we had before in Matera was really nice. We had a tower in the foreground and a tower in the background, and we had the beautiful city lights. But for this shot, it's a little bit different because we're breaking out of the city itself and framing it with a little bit of the ancient nature. The composition itself is pretty straightforward. I backed up in the cave a little bit so that I can have most of the town in the frame, put the camera a little bit lower so I don't crop any of the town or the tower itself. For this shot, it was really important to me that I show the entire mouth of the cave, a little bit of the ground, and some of the green in the bushes too. Something to point out is this isn't the only composition you could shoot here. Just moving up or down a little bit changes it, but basically the whole idea was to be able to frame the entire cave and the city behind it. While the framing is pretty straightforward for this shot, the technical aspects are a little bit tricky because I'm actually close to the mouth of the cave itself. Even though I'm shooting fairly wide, I'm having a discrepancy in focus between the background and the foreground. So the background in this case is the city itself. If I focus on that, the camera tells me it's focused to infinite, which is usually what we use for this type of photography. But if I focus on the closest part of the cave above, it's actually showing me that it is a different focal plane. Looking through the camera, it's hard to tell if the background or the foreground is out of focus when I actually change between the background focus and the foreground. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to shoot both of them and use a technique called focus stacking to put them together. So the first step is focus on the background. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to move the focus icon to the background. I'm going to focus on that tower, and it's going to give me a reading of infinite. Then I'm going to go ahead and shoot those three brackets. After I capture the background, I'm going to change the focus to capture the cave itself. Just like I thought, it gives me a different reading, and I'm going to shoot that as well. Now again, I'm not sure if the discrepancy in focus is enough to warrant focus stacking now, but my big fear is that when I get back into post-processing and I look at these images really large in Photoshop, I notice that the foreground is blurry if I just focus on the background. So what I've done is I've captured the focus for the background and the foreground, so later on in post-processing, I can potentially blend those two things together. My camera settings here are a little different than I usually have it. It's not f8 this time, but f11. So changing from f8 to f11 gives me a better depth of field to be able to capture objects that are close to the camera and far away from the camera. So f8 is the perfect f-stop for this lens where we don't get any diffraction. f11 seems to be pretty good as well. Some people may want to try to push their cameras to f22, but I'd strongly advise against that. The reason being, once you start getting past 11 and closer to f22, you end up with diffraction. Diffraction can be a pretty nasty element because as you change your f-stop to make things sharper, diffraction actually makes them softer, so you get negative effects on the lens as well. Focus stacking may seem a little complicated, but it gives you the ability to select your f-stop, whether it's f8 or f11, something that doesn't have any diffraction at all, and then blend the frames back together so you get no negative effects of a high f-stop. What you've noticed throughout the tutorial so far is I really like to put my camera in interval timer shooting mode, but in this case I can't do that because I have to focus first on the background and then the foreground. So every time that I shoot, I actually have to do this. One set of brackets for the background and one for the foreground. So there's no way to really automate that. I actually have to do it manually. So I'm not shooting every 1 to 2 minutes like I usually do when I can automate the camera. I may be shooting once every 5 minutes. And then when the lighting gets perfect, when it's the perfect blue hour, then I tend to focus on it a little bit more. I'll shoot the background and the foreground, and then I won't wait too long between the next cycle. It's important to note that I did get up here early enough to frame everything while I still had light in the sky. Now that was important for a couple reasons. One, I didn't want to set everything up in the dark, and two, if I did set up everything in the dark, this cave is completely dark as well. So being up here during the day at the last bit of light gave me the ability to see all of the elements that I wanted to frame the shot with and also capture some of that ambient light. The target for this shot was actually a blue hour, but what I hope I'm able to do is blend in some of the foreground elements, the cave, the background, the mountain, the bushes themselves, by using an early blue hour shot when I still have ambient light, and then blending in the beautiful lights from the city on a later blue hour. Even though my plan is to use the natural light from an early blue hour combined with a later blue hour for the city itself, I also have a panel light with me. And I decided to set the panel light up for a couple reasons. One, it's really dark in here, so it's kind of like a work light that actually helps me stay in here and get the job done. Two, I don't want the cave to just be completely blacked out, because when I start to blend things together in post-processing, it's going to be really difficult if I just have a black edge for the cave and I'm trying to blend an early blue hour in. It's actually easier if I have a lit cave, so I can blend the early blue hour with a lit version of the cave and use percentages in between. In that case, I can toggle a layer and use simple opacity changes rather than having to isolate or cut out the edge of the cave itself. So in this case, I have a couple versions to choose from, and it's going to be really interesting to see this in post-processing. I don't usually use panel lights or any kind of light painting in my photography. I like to blend natural light from maybe a sunset or an early blue hour with a late blue hour like I'm trying to do in this case. But now with my series of shots, I have the natural light of the cave before it got dark, and I have the artificial light from my panel light. So when we get into post-processing, it's going to be really interesting to see the difference. And I may actually like some of the light from the panel light for a late blue hour mixed with some of the early light from the early blue hour before I was using the light. Right now, I'm not sure, but if I had to guess, my wager would be that I'm going to use the natural light, but I'm pretty excited to see if I can use some of the artificial light as well. Talking specifically about the panel light, the way that I had it set up in the shot, I basically set it in the back of the cave, firing straight out on the cave, so it gave me even illumination on the floor and the top of the cave. My worry about using that by itself is that it will look too unnatural. If you take a look at this time lapse, you can actually see the city and the panel light's effect on the cave mouth itself. If you look at the city, there is a lot of artificial light in the city, so maybe it's not out of the realm of possibility that somebody actually has a light in this cave. So in the end, it may not look unnatural at all. The panel light's a pretty interesting element to add. I don't usually do that in my photography, but the most important thing from this shot, the takeaway, is the focus stacking. If you have a great difference in your focus reading from the background to foreground, it's always a good idea to go ahead and focus on the background, shoot your brackets or your single exposure, and then also focus on the closest element as well. That way, you won't be sorry if things aren't completely in focus later. You'll be able to have each version and put it back together to create a perfect shot in the end. This area was really fun to photograph. It's a great opportunity to use the ancient cave, framing the ancient city, and the hike was beautiful as well. I'm really looking forward to taking these shots into post-processing and see what type of blend of the panel light, the natural light, the early blue hour, and the late blue hour. I'm really excited to see how this is all going to come together. So the next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the studio. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the post-processing studio. We're going to be putting together the Rubik's Cube of a blend that this cave shot has turned out to be. Now the first thing I want to talk about is the focus stacking. Now while I was there, it was a little tough to tell. Everything was really far away, but when I was actually setting the focus in the camera, it did seem like the background just wasn't going to be in focus with the foreground. So I went ahead and shot all those exposures throughout that whole duration of the time that we were there. I shot one focus for the foreground and one focused for the background. But when I got back into post-processing, I zoomed all the way into the town and all the way into the cave, and I toggled back and forth between them, and I honestly couldn't tell a difference. It seemed like the discrepancy seemed greater in camera, and it's always hard to see on those tiny little LCD panels on the back of the cameras. It seemed more intense, and when I got into post, it just seemed like I didn't need it at all. So thankfully, I did shoot it just in case I needed it, but it turned out that I didn't need it. However, what's really interesting, and we're going to take a look at this, is I was set on this being a early blue hour with ambient light lighting the cave kind of shot. I didn't think that I was actually going to like the panel lights, especially with the warming gel on it. It made everything a little bit too warm, in my opinion. But getting this into post-processing, I was actually pleasantly surprised with it. So we're going to have to do a couple things that are a little bit different. Let's go ahead and jump right into Lightroom, and I'll kind of show you what we have here. I've brought 3 images in. So this image here, right now, this is going to act as the base exposure. This is basically with the sun setting behind us, it's blowing out the sky itself, it's washing out the foreground, and you can see I'm still getting some ambient light on the cave mouth itself. Toggle over to the right to the next image. This is a little later, maybe 3-4 minutes. You can see it's slightly later in the blue hour. The lights are a little bit more intense. More importantly though, you can see that this is the result of the panel light. So between here and here, you can see the big difference, and you can actually see that the shadows are kind of changing. If I toggle that, you'll see that the shadows are redistributed just a little bit. The other thing is, if we go one more step in the future, this is going to be a late blue hour. This is just about when I packed things up for the night. Now, notice how that panel light is barely interacting with this cave mouth, and this is all black down here. It's gone, it's shifted all the way to the left. Those blacks are destroyed. But check this out, notice that I got clouds. So with the previous shot of Matera, it started beautifully cloudy and then went clear. But this was the opposite situation. It was clear all day, and then just before full dark, we got some clouds. So we're going to do everything that we can to put all 3 of these images together. But first, just like we always do, and these are always zeroed out when you open this, we're going to change the noise reduction to 20 here, and I'll go ahead and hit return so that that's done. And we'll just go ahead and sync that up really quickly. So, develop settings, sync settings. Perfect. Now we're ready to go. Let's move up and start making the basic adjustments to our base exposure. Let's pull the highlights down a little bit to get some of the sky back. Let's pull the shadows up to get that foreground back. And let's bring up some of the blacks here. It's probably a little too much. Subtly here, and we'll just make these even amounts. Perfect. So small adjustment to begin with, and let's go ahead and examine this one. Let's make some small changes. We need to bring the highlights down just a little bit to match this. Let's make it as even and as close to the other one. And also you can see those whites in the buildings themselves. Those need to come way down. So just small adjustments right now for these, and we'll go ahead and bring this one into Photoshop as well. I'll select all, I'll copy this, and we'll bring this in to the original composition. We'll name this Edited Base Layer. We'll call this Edited, parentheses, Lighting Layer. So here we go. So we basically have nearly the same 2 shots, but this is with natural lighting, and this is with panel lighting. So this is really interesting because with the darker shot, you could really see how that was starting to fail near the edges. In other words, the light was not carrying because there was no ambient light. So this is, yes, panel lit, but it's actually a blend between the panel light and the ambient light, giving it those warm tones. Now originally, I thought I was going to like a complete cool tonality here, but to be honest, I feel like this is too blue, and I'd want to warm it up anyway. In other words, the sky's already blue here, so I want this to be contrasty on the edge. So if we move to the edited lighting one with the panel light, you can see that I'm actually pretty happy with the way that that looked. So that's actually going to be the layer that I'm going to choose as the real base layer. Now, bear in mind, if you wanted to use percentages of this, we could change the opacity. Now let's experiment with that. Maybe we want a certain percentage of this cave to be illuminated. But as I start to move, I feel like that's still a little too flat. As I go up to 100%, now I'm starting to feel like that cave looks natural, like a naturally warm cave. So we're going to go, in this case, and this was counter to my intuition in the field, with the panel light. So it goes to show you that even though I was convinced I'd already made up my mind in the field, I apparently was wrong. I like this one better. So let's go back into Lightroom and let's see what we can do about that sky layer. Let's examine this layer. First thing, I'm going to have to bring those highlights down quite a bit, and those shadows and blacks up quite a bit too. So let's just go ahead and do another 50-50 here. And for good measure, another half a stop here just in the blacks. Now this detail's gone, that's okay. I'm really going to focus on this portion of the town and the sky itself. So those simple adjustments are all I think we're going to need for now. We go ahead and right click, export this with previous, get it into Photoshop. Select all, copy, and we'll paste this on top. So we'll call this late blue and sky layer. Perfect. All right, now just like last time, we need to get that part of the sky and part of this town inside of the cave mouth. So I'm just going to look at either one of these. Looks pretty good. What we're actually going to do is go up to select, and we're going to use the select and mask feature. Transparency here I had already set in the last time, so let's just go ahead and turn that down a little bit. Now what I'm actually going to do is just with the brush tool, I'm just going to brush in the sky really quick, and it's actually just going to select it almost instantly. Now if I change this, by hitting K on the keyboard, I can actually see that mask and what I selected. Now that looks pretty good already. Black and white already looks pretty solid. Some areas here that we're going to have to worry about a little bit. If I hit the M key, you can see it's going to bring the selection and the ants here. And in this case, with that in mind, I can just go ahead and grab the lasso and hold Shift, and I'm just going to go ahead and clean this area up a little bit. We'll include the crane, the iconic crane. That actually, you know, for an easy selection, looks really, really good. Let's look at the black and white one more time by hitting K. Let's change the contrast. I'll bring in some of those micro edges where we had a problem with. Let's change this to right around 40%. It looks pretty good. Output this to selection. Let's go to the channel so we can save this. We'll create a new channel, and we'll call this Sky Base. The reason is I might make changes to this later, but for now, I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to leave this activated, and I'm going to create a folder, and we'll call this Sky and Blue Hour. Perfect. Let's go ahead and drop this right in there. All right. Well, so far that looks pretty good, but notice we have a small halo. A really, really small halo. Now we can do a couple things here, but there is something I want to show you guys. The reason we're getting this is an edge selection, so it basically selected those edges. Those edges are anti-alias, but we've created a selection without anti-aliasing. So we could go up here and we could feather that a little bit. But you can see as we feather it, it's just going to soften that. So we're going to soften that halo, so it's not really going to look really that great. But if we use 1 or 0.5, it's going to give us a nice edge, but it still doesn't clean up that halo. So here's a really cool way to change a selection from a border selection to a slight inside selection. I'm going to load this as a selection again, go up to the select menu, and I'm going to modify and expand it by 1 pixel. And you can see now it's an inside edge selection. With that, I'm going to go ahead and delete this mask, and we'll just go ahead and delete it, and I'm going to create a new mask. So now you can see that I don't have a halo anymore, but I do have a sharp edge. Since there's no halo, I can go here to this option and change it to about half a pixel feather, just like that. And it's going to clean up that edge and make it a little bit more natural. Now, you might be noticing down here that the tower has some issues. That's not really that big of a deal. What I'm mostly concerned about here is the cave itself. And that's starting to look pretty good, and we're going to go ahead and clean some of that up as well. First things first, once again, I kind of forgot this little area. So what I'm going to do is actually magic wand select this. So up here, magic wand tool, and I'm just going to select this. Same thing, select, modify, expand 1 pixel, and we'll remove it from the mask, or actually in this case, add it to the mask by adding white. Perfect. Now we get that in there. Nice. So what I actually want to do is soften this up a little bit, but I also want to use some of this Blue Hour town. If I take a look at this, I don't really want to use much of the cave mouth, though I have some discrepancy for blending. What I actually want to do is use the dark part of the town because it looks much better. It's not as washed out. So with this selected, now remember, I've saved my original mask just in case I need to make changes to it. Just in case I go too far, I can always back up a step. But I'm going to go ahead and lightly paint in the later Blue Hour to the town, just like this. We'll also clean up some of those edges around the cave. That looks pretty good. Same thing down here. Just going to go ahead and add some of this in, and you can see that it actually brings it in. Now, the tonality of this was completely different. This was a late blue hour shot that I wanted to blend with an early blue hour shot, but it really takes a long time for that sun to really pass below the horizon before the blue hour gets extra intense. So something like this will just go ahead and bring the intensity up. I'll back that up a little bit. And I'm just going to custom paint. So as we take a look at this, you can see what this mask starts to look like. We'll make sure that we include all of this without missing anything. Clean it up a little bit more. We'll also clean up this edge as well. Now let's take a look. So what do we have so far? We have from here to here to here. That's starting to look pretty good, but obviously I'm going to go ahead and fade a little bit more into the town. So we have that nice late blue hour right in the middle of the town there. We'll take a look at that again. Nice. That's starting to look really, really good. Next step, my very favorite, object removal. Yay! All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get rid of a few things. Now it is late here, so there are a few stars to get rid of. I always hate painting out stars, but they just look distracting. They look like hot pixels, and I know there are probably a few more hiding around here. Oh, that looks pretty good. There's one. I know I'm going to miss a few. When you guys open up this file, no doubt I'm going to have missed just a few. Next thing I want to do is talk about removing these cranes. So I feel like they're very distracting now. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, I'm not going to create a new layer like I did before. Remember when we were using masks, we'd actually draw a mask around an object and create a mask on a new layer and then paint this in. What I'm actually going to do, I'm going to use a slightly different technique. Let's start with this little crane over here. I'm just going to use the lasso tool, and I'm going to simply draw around the edge of this as if I were going to create another layer. But I'm going to do this in a quicker, simplified step so this can all be on the same layer. And I'll just go ahead and draw this around just like this. With this selection in place, I'm going to go up to Select, Modify, Feather, and I'm going to feather this by 1 pixel. With that selection enabled, I'm going to use the clone stamp, and I'm going to find, this is going to be tough because I can't grab an area up here and paint that in. See how the color difference is too intense? So what I'm actually going to do is zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to find areas of similar color. So around here I feel like the colors are very similar, and I'm just going to start brushing that color in, just like that. And you can see that I am getting a little bit of a color disturbance there, so I'm just going to bring in some of the surrounding areas and fade it with a low opacity just so it's close. And I'll deselect that. Back it up a little bit, and you can see that before and after, that looks pretty convincing. So we're going to do this to this crane as well. We'll zoom in, pull up the lasso tool, and I'm going to start it probably about here. Hold Option to lock it to a linear lasso tool. Just go ahead and chop that off right there. And the same thing here, I'm going to go ahead and cut one of those guys off, just like that. Draw a really wide lasso around that. Go up to the Select, Modify, Feather by 1 pixel. Back to the clone stamp. Now this is a larger one, but you see that the blue is pretty uniform around it, or it should be. So if I grab something here and I start to paint and really chase that object from the right to the left, it should bring in similar color all around. And yes, just like I thought, similar color all around. What I can do is just go ahead and fade in that edge just a little bit. And if it's starting to leave lines, check your flow and go to a lower amount, something like 10. I was using 20. So soft brushes, and what I'm doing is sampling from here and then brushing across. So when I continue to brush across, it's distributing that color pretty far. We'll go right down to the base of this, right around here. That's looking pretty good, actually. Well, let's clean it up. Deselect, back it up. That looks pretty good. Now, some other distracting objects in this scene. I think we've gotten rid of most of them. We could remove the cars here, but they're so far in the distance. Some of these little spots down here look funny to me, so we'll go ahead and just remove these little white spots just to get rid of those. A little too distracting for my taste. And lastly, I feel like this part of the cave is a little distracting. So I'm going to try content aware first. And that failed horribly. So let's go ahead and do that manually. 20% flow. Any of this texture will work. That's not a problem at all. Let's go ahead and bring some more texture up. Get rid of some of this. Now at this point in the cave, we can decide if any of this is distracting. Like for example, these dark black spots. Do you find those distracting? If so, this is the time to get rid of them. So we can just go ahead and get rid of those very easily. It's basically repeating texture again, so it's not that big of a deal. Same thing around here. We can bring up some of that cave moss and remove some of those dark black spots. Pretty simple stuff. Perfect. That looks pretty good. Before I go further, let me go back into Lightroom. I'm just going to go ahead and bring in the original base exposure. I'm going to export it with previous. And since I already did that, I'll use unique names. Select all. And we'll just bring that into the bottom here. We'll call this original raw. I'll select all of these, Command G, we'll group them together, and we'll call this blended result. With this blended result, I'm going to go ahead and remove the distortion of this image, and since my camera is pointing up, everything's kind of doing this again, so we're going to have to stretch that back out. Now, while everything's selected here in this sky and blue hour, what I may want to do, if I want to keep the channels, because the channels won't change, is select the sky base and basically just put this on a layer. So we're just going to call this Sky Clean Matte or Sky Clean Mask. Reason being is we're getting ready to transform this. Now, bring up the rulers, Command R, and I'm going to draw a few guides, one for the top of the tower and another one for about the base of the tower here. I just want to keep track of how tall that actually is, because when I enable transformation, Command T, and I hold Command, I'm going to skew. Now remember, if I hold Shift, it locks it. If I add the Option key, it uniformly does it on both sides. As I start to remove this distortion, just like that, I'm also squashing the town. So after I do that, I'm going to have to scale it up just a little bit until I feel like that tower is the same size. And now it's very, very close. I might want to go up a little bit more and hit Enter. Let's go ahead and hide with Command semicolon, and Command R will hide the rulers, and Command Z back and forth, and you can see that I've been able to remove a lot of that distortion. Now everything's still intact here. Let's go ahead and create a new layer here so we can get into the camera raw filter. Shift Option Command E, you guys should have that memorized by now, and ACRF, and we're going to go up here to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. First of all, let's pull those highlights down a little bit, just a little bit. And also, you know what, we're going to have to bring those shadows up a little bit. It's still a little dark, and the blacks as well. I still feel like that's a little dark, because we're going to have to bring those back a little bit. Now with that, let's go to the dehaze slider and let's see if we can add some deep contrast to this image. That looks pretty good. And it's a good thing too, I added that and the compensation here with the shadows and the highlights. Next thing I want to do is adjust the luminosity of this part itself. So see this, I actually want to go into the HSL and go to the luminance, and I can actually change the luminance of the cave. So see, actually I can brighten this just a little bit more just by bumping the color itself. I'm changing the yellows in the luminance. Obviously I can darken it as well, but what I want to do is just bring this up to about 20, and I think that looks pretty good. Let's apply it. Well, we're starting to get something closer to final, but the first thing is I love the warm against the blue, but I'm not a fan of all of this extra blue color down here. So let's go ahead and mitigate some of that using one of my favorite methods and the easiest methods, hue saturation. Let's go to the blues themselves, move it a little bit into the cyans, and I'm going to bring up the lightness until I like the result. That looks pretty good. So about 40, that's pretty dramatic actually. And what I'm going to do, we're going to call this blue reduction. Now, just sometimes I feel that it looks a little too undersaturated. I actually want to warm that up a little bit, so let's compensate by bringing in a quick photo filter, and I'll just pick the third one, the 81, and I'm going to link this to the blue reduction. So now I'm basically going to look at these values. Those values look a little bit better now that they're a little bit more warm than they were before. So we warm them up just a little bit, and let's go ahead and call this warming filter. And let's zero out this mask. Perfect. Zoom in here and start custom painting some of this. So we'll start over here. It'll be the easy side, and I'll just go ahead and brush this in lightly around this area here. And that should clean up all of that blue. Yeah, that actually looks pretty nice. And as a side effect here, I'm actually going to warm up some of those yellows there on the this little tall grass section. There's a little bit more blue here. This area is going to be a little tricky. I'm just going to have to blend this in just a little bit, not a lot. I don't want to have to get into too technical masking here. I just want to go ahead and blend it so it's close to the edge. It looks pretty good. You can also remove some of the blue here in the town, some of this, and some of it over here too. One last pass here for the cleanup. That looks pretty good. So before and after there on the blue reduction, that's looking pretty nice. While we're at it, let's also grab one more photo filter here, but this time let's make it a green filter. And I'll turn that up just a little bit. And we'll call this green filter. Black that out as well. We obviously don't want the whole image to be green. Go ahead and zoom it in, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint some of this green right onto these areas here. And it's going to be subtle, and that's how I want it to be. I want it to be very subtle. Let's back that out a little bit. Just go ahead and brush that in. Perfect. So we end up with a little bit of foliage or grass or something. I can even put a little bit of that in the background. Just a hair. Just a touch. Because this shouldn't be as washed out as it is. Cool. Subtle, but looks pretty good. Next thing, let's go ahead and redistribute some of the light in the foreground. I feel like this lighting feels really nice, but down here it feels a little bit dull. So I'm going to create a dodge and burn layer to take care of some of that landscape. So again, dodge and burn, hold the option key, click the create a new layer, change it, name it, change the mode to overlay, which we're very comfortable with by now, and fill it with 50% gray. Now, again, if I paint white, I'll actually get a brighter image. If I paint black, I'll get a darker image. Now, what I want to do is lightly, very lightly, and so lightly that I want a flow of maybe 5%, I just want to paint in some of these natural highlights here. One, let's say on these bushes, so bring these bushes out and the grass itself. You can see that I can bring the details of the grass almost like it's receiving more light. Same thing here, following these natural highlights of this area down here as well. And then see how this is sort of a pooling highlight into a shadow? I can actually increase the dramatic element of that lighting as if we have more ambient light on the ground itself. I don't want to go too heavy on this. I may also want to bring some of this up in the town, separate it a little bit from the rest of the rocks there, and then just work a little bit more on this pooling element here and these highlights. That's this one. Let's bring this guy up too, right around here. Just some interesting details in the foreground, kind of separate it from the background a little bit. And if we take a look at that before and after, you can see we probably need to extend a little bit more into this area. That looks pretty good. Next step, let me go ahead and duplicate this. Command J. We'll call this high pass, 2.5. And I'm just going to go back up to the filter and the high pass filter, 2.5. Set this to overlay. Now, I definitely want to knock out the sky, but I definitely want this foreground to be razor sharp. So remember, I have saved that clean mask of the sky. So what I'm actually going to do here, we'll go ahead and close that up. With the high pass filter, what I'm going to do is take this mask. First thing I'm going to do is expand it. So select, modify, expand. So let's expand it by something like 15 pixels. Now, I'm going to invert it, Command-Shift-I, and I'm going to apply it to the high-pass filter. This way, it's away from the edges of the image, but what I can actually do now, you can see how if I overlay the Rubylith mode, you can see that's on the inside, but if I go up to the mask options, I can feather it quite a bit before I leave the edge. So I can feather it maybe 6 pixels, and it won't actually leave that edge. Now it'll soften up to the edge that I determined by expanding that mask. So now I get a nice sharpening all around this area in the foreground, and I don't have any of it on the sky itself. So with the same thing, I'm going to go here, Command J, and we're going to call this noise reduction. We'll go back into the camera raw filter and apply some noise reduction to this. I'll zoom it in so we can take a look. So in the sky, there's not a lot of noise actually, because we didn't do much to the sky itself, but we're still going to have to go in and change this. I have a feeling to about 35, and we'll pull some of the detail back. I'll say OK. Same thing with the noise reduction. We have the sky itself, so I can go back to that again. Select the clean mask for the sky and mask that in. And that actually looks pretty nice. Not too bad. All right, let me go ahead and pack all this back up, and we can go ahead and take a look at everything that we've done to this scene. Again, this actually turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, because we were able to use a lot of the natural layers and then just accentuate some of the tones and the highlights within. So we started with the original one here, and we'll go to the original, but we decided that I liked the warm one a little bit better. From there we actually added the sky, and then we added some contrast here, sharpening, dodging, and burning on the foreground. And the big reveal here at the end, we have the original base exposure, and then we have the after with all of our edits. So quite a dramatic difference, and not a very difficult process to put it all together. Well, that wraps everything up here in the studio for this lesson and everything in Italy. The next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the field, and we are going to be shooting a completely different style of architecture.